This game has an interesting story and a bit of a warning, particularly if someone wants to be disrespectful to another opponent. In this case, the player Jose Raul Capablanca was disrespected by Dr. Osip Bernstein. Well, the context was this tournament at San Sebastian in 1911. The invitations only went out to people that had finished fourth or better 2 times in major global tournaments. The only exception was Capablanca. He was invited simply because of his match against Marshall, his success in that match. And there was some grumbling among the other players, particularly Dr. Bernstein protested and said this is a big mistake to let Capablanca in. He had not achieved the standards necessary for admission. Well, it turns out they got paired in the first round. Capablanca had white, Dr. Bernstein had black. Let's see how this turns out. Capablanca begins with d4. Bernstein plays d5. Knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, knight b to d7, bishop g5. Standard Queen's Gambit declined stuff. Bishop to e7, e3, c6, bishop to d3, dc4, bishop c4, then b5, the bishop goes to d3, and a6. And we see a fairly standard formation. Black wants to play c5 to challenge white's center, then the bishop can go to b7 and get some play on the long diagonal. But before he has a chance to do that, Capablanca immediately plays e4. He's threatening to play e5, gaining space and a real stronghold in the middle of the board and real attacking potential in this position. So Dr. Bernstein plays e5 to stop him from doing that. Of course, he's giving up a pawn, but perhaps he thought he was going to be able to recover that pawn very quickly. We'll see. Pawn takes, and now knight to g4. So black is attacking that pawn on e5 twice, as well as offering the exchange of dark squared bishops. But Capablanca says, I think I can keep that pawn and just keep the extra material and the space that goes with it. So he plays bishop to f4, defending the pawn a second time. Bishop to c5 from Dr. Bernstein, threatening to take on f2 with checks, but obviously castling is the remedy for that. But then queen to c7. So now he's attacking e5 3 times. Both knights, the queen, and then the only knight and bishop are defending. So how does Capablanca maintain that pawn? Well, he plays rook to c1, and he's placing his rook opposite black's queen. Now, there's a lot of junk in the way, right? Black has a pawn, a bishop, white has his own knight there. It doesn't matter. The potential for tactics still exists, even with all these pawns in between the rook and the queen, as we will see. F6, excuse me, was played by black, trying to take advantage of the fact that if pawn takes pawn, he would be able to take the bishop at f4. Capablanca just drops the bishop back. So black is going to be able to recover this pawn on e5. The question is, at what price? Perhaps the best move for black would be to take with the knight, but after Capablanca exchanges knights, and then he could play this move, knight takes b5. Again, taking advantage of this rook on the c file, and after cb5, b4, taking advantage of the pinned bishop, he would have the bishop pair, a safer king, and a nice lead in development. White's probably just completely winning here. He has a big advantage in that position. So because of that, Dr. Bernstein goes ahead and takes with the pawn instead. But that will provide him no relief. Capablanca's next move almost looks like a blunder when you first see it, but it's a brilliant shot. It's the move b4. Looks like he's just dropping a pawn. Well, Grandmaster Bernstein was smart enough not to take that pawn. He wasn't a GM yet. He became a GM later. They didn't have the title when this game was played. If he had taken the pawn, Capablanca would have played this move, knight to d5. Again, taking advantage of the rook at c1 opposite the queen. The knight forks the queen and the bishop, so black has to move the queen somewhere where it will defend the bishop, a5 or queen to d6. But then taking the bishop, queen takes rook to c6, and again, white has a huge advantage. After castling bishop c2, he's going to play bishop to b3 with check, and after h3, kicking this knight, he's going to take the e5 pawn. White is completely winning in this position. And knowing that, black goes ahead and plays the bishop back to a7 to avoid all of those complications. However, there's no relief here. Capablanca plays, boom, bishop to b5, capturing this pawn. This bishop can be taken two different ways. He takes with the a pawn. Now knight to b5. Again, taking advantage of that rook down the c-file. The knight can't be taken. The queen would be lost. The queen goes to d8, and knight to d6, check. So Capablanca has sacrificed a piece, but what has he gotten in return? Two pawns, and he's made it so black cannot castle because he's delivered check. That's easily worth 2 pawns for a piece. And he's got this beautiful knight at d6. White is clearly better. And sending a message to his detractor. King to f8, rook takes c6, now getting a third pawn in exchange for that piece. White is in great shape here. The knight goes to b6 to keep the queen out of d5. If white can play the queen to d5 with threats of mate on f7, that's a big problem. So knight to b6 to keep that queen out of d5. Bishop to h4 hits the black queen, which doesn't have a lot of available squares, actually. The queen goes to d7, putting some pressure on that rook at c6. And Capablanca could just play b5 here, defending that rook, and he would be perfectly fine. He'd be in good shape. But he decides to give up the exchange. I think maybe he's trying to prove a point here. So he goes ahead and takes on c8 with his knight. Bernstein takes the rook at c6, but now queen to d8 check. This is a big problem for black. If he plays king to f7, then knight to d6 check. If he plays the king to g6, then queen to g5 is checkmate. You see the knight controls this f7 square, so that would be mate. If instead he plays to e6, queen to e7 is checkmate. So black's next move is forced. He plays queen to e8 to block. But now bishop to e7 check. The queen can't take this bishop because it's pinned. So the king has to move to f7 because he has to stay in contact with the queen, otherwise he would lose it. But now knight to d6 check. Now this forks the king and the queen, but it's not, black doesn't have to leave yet because he's also attacking white's queen. So he still has some play here. He plays king to g6, and if white were to take the queen in this position, it's actually a fairly equal position. So that would be a mistake. Capablanca has to keep throwing logs on the fire to keep it burning, which he does with knight to h4 check, pushing that king further and further away from safety. The king goes to h5. If he goes to h6, then after knight df5 check, king to h5, then knight to g3 would be played. And after king to h6, bishop g5 is checkmate. Look at that. What an interesting construction of pieces to deliver a mate. So he has to play the king to h5. But now knight takes queen. But black does get to take Capablanca's queen. He does not immediately retake that rook. He plays knight to g7 check. King to h6. Knight g to f5 check. The king has to go to h5. Doesn't really have a choice. Then h3. Again, not taking the rook, but still going after black's king, threatening that knight. And if that knight tries to retreat to safety at h6, you see white's next move? Boom. Knight to g7 checkmate. Another very original pattern. You rarely see this kind of mating pattern in a game of chess. That would have been quite beautiful. But Bernstein, being a strong player, sees that. He plays the knight back to c8 to kick that bishop away, which is sort of supporting all of these threats with these knights. Capablanca takes on g4 with check, king g4, and now finally he takes the rook, and rook takes d8. And we can see black's king is in a very strange position. Now white is up 3 pawns, but the pieces are still balanced, 2 minors and a rook versus 2 minors and a rook. So black wants to play on and see if he can restrain Capablanca's queenside pawns and maybe put pressure on e4. That might be a source of counterplay for black. g3 is played by Capablanca. Rook to d2, putting pressure on the f2 pawn, which is currently pinned by the bishop. The king goes up to g2. The pawn is still pinned now by the rook, but his king is definitely in a better place. Rook to e2, and we see Bernstein going after that e4 pawn. Capablanca says, no worries, and just goes ahead and begins to advance his queenside pawns. The knight goes to b6, hitting a5, but also threatening to jump into c4. And if a5, knight c4, all of a sudden black is getting some irritating pressure that white would rather not have to deal with. So Capablanca plays this move, knight to e3 check, with tempo because of the check, interfering with the rook's attack on e4, and also taking away the c4 square from black's knight so it cannot activate. So after he moves his king to h5, then when he plays a5, the knight can't come into c4. It has to retreat, which it does back to d7. Now knight hf5, with threats of the rook could come to h1 and cause a lot of trouble. So knight to f6, again attacking e4. b5, the threat of course is b6, completely blocking this bishop out of play, and the pawns would just advance, and that would be the game. So black plays bishop to d4 first, so the bishop doesn't get trapped after b6. King to f3. He uses his king, Capablanca does, to defend e4, and he also gains a tempo against the rook at e2. The rook goes to a2 to attack the pawn moves to a6, and now bishop to a7. What black is hoping for is that he can maintain the blockade on these dark squares on a7 and b6. Unlikely. Rook to c1 from Capablanca. He's going in to break the blockade, right? He's going in to kick that bishop away so it can no longer control a7 and b6. Rook to b2, attacking the pawn at b5. Now g4 check, a very important move to set up Capablanca's next idea. King to g6, and here comes a huge blow. Rook to c7, a big double attack. Of course, he's threatening to just take the bishop at a7. He's also threatening rook to g7 mate. If bishop to b6, rook to g7 is checkmate. There's nowhere that king can go. He's completely mated. So black has one last gasp. He doesn't want to resign just yet. Rook takes f2 check, king takes f2, knight to g4 check. Obviously, he can't take on g4 with his knight because it's pinned, but it doesn't really matter. And after king to f3, Grandmaster Bernstein resigned, and Capablanca sent a message not only to his opponent, but to the entire chess world that a new force was on the scene. We, of course, many years later in hindsight, realize how great that force was. Of course, in this position, Capablanca would have won very easily. So I hope you've enjoyed this game of historical importance, and see you again soon in Chess Talk. Goodbye.